The dream that became a warning. Marcus sat in the empty auditorium of the NBA Rookie Transition Program, staring at the 7 faces projected on the screen before him. Each face told a story, not of triumph on the hardwood, but of financial devastation off it. These weren't cautionary tales from obscure players. These were all-stars, champions, legends who had commanded the court and captured millions of hearts. Yet despite earning fortunes most people couldn't imagine in 10 lifetimes, they had all fallen into the same trap. The statistics were sobering. 60% of NBA players go broke within 5 years of retirement. It was a pattern as old as wealth itself, similar to how most wealthy families lose their fortune by the 3rd generation. But for Marcus, a 20-year-old kid from Chicago who had just signed his rookie contract, these weren't just numbers. They were warnings written in the wreckage of broken dreams. Chapter 1. Antoine Walker, the man who couldn't say no. Antoine Walker had it all. 3-time All-Star. NBA champion. A smile that could light up an arena and a game that made Boston faithful believe in magic again. Over his 13-year career, he earned an astounding $108 million. To put that in perspective, that's enough money to buy a new luxury car every single day for over 60 years. But Antoine had a fatal flaw: he couldn't say no. "I had over 30 people depending on me," he would later admit, his voice heavy with the weight of hindsight. Friends from the neighborhood, distant relatives who suddenly remembered his phone number, hangers-on who treated his generosity like an ATM with no withdrawal limit. He bought homes for people who didn't ask. He covered bills for friends who never intended to pay him back. He funded business ventures that existed only in the imaginations of smooth-talking opportunists. The luxury items came next: a fleet of cars that could have stocked a dealership, jewelry that glittered with the promise of permanence but held no lasting value, clothes that went out of style before the tags were removed. He was living the dream, or so it seemed. Then came the investments. Antoine dove into real estate with the confidence of a man who had never missed a shot that mattered. He purchased properties across multiple states, convinced that land was the path to generational wealth. But timing, as they say, is everything. When the 2008 recession hit like a sledgehammer to the American economy, his portfolio crumbled. Properties he'd bought at peak prices were suddenly worth half their purchase value, and the debt collectors came calling with the persistence of playoff pressure. Gambling added the final devastating chapter. Casino debts piled up, hundreds of thousands vanished across poker tables and sports bets made with the reckless confidence of someone who'd beaten the odds his entire life. Until suddenly, the odds beat him back. By 2010, Antoine Walker, who had earned more than most people see in 100 lifetimes, filed for bankruptcy. The boy who'd lifted himself out of poverty had fallen back into financial ruin, proving that wealth without wisdom is just a countdown to zero. Chapter 2. Larry Johnson, the weight of obligation. Larry Johnson was Grandmama, the marketing sensation who became one of the most recognizable faces in basketball during the 1990s. His thunderous dunks and fierce competitive spirit earned him $83 million over his career. He was supposed to be set for life. But life had other plans, or rather, Larry did. The downfall came not from mansions or sports cars, but from something far more complex and emotionally fraught: family obligations. Larry had children with multiple partners, 5 children total, and the child support obligations became an avalanche that buried his fortune. The payments weren't just substantial, they were crushing. Month after month, year after year, massive portions of his income flowed out to meet his legal obligations. Unlike some athletes who could point to a scam artist or a single catastrophic investment, Larry's situation was different. These were his children, his responsibilities, and the consequences of choices made during his playing days. The courts showed no mercy and no special consideration for his celebrity status. Child support calculations are based on income during peak earning years, but they don't adjust when the paychecks stop coming. By 2015, Larry Johnson filed for bankruptcy. The man who had once been worth tens of millions found himself unable to meet his obligations, his earnings consumed by the mathematical reality of percentage-based child support across multiple households. His story became a stark reminder: wealth isn't just about what you earn. It's about understanding the long-term consequences of every decision, every relationship, every obligation you create when the money is flowing freely. Chapter 3. Eric Strickland, the betrayal of trust. Not every cautionary tale involves a superstar. Eric Strickland was an undrafted player who fought his way into the league through sheer determination and talent. Over 9 seasons, he earned $13 million, a fortune by any normal measure, if not by NBA standards. He was smart, careful, and determined not to become another statistic. So he did what many young players do. He trusted family to protect his interests. It was the worst decision he ever made. The family members who promised to manage his finances led him into real estate investments that looked golden on paper but were built on lies. Property appraisals were falsified, making worthless land appear valuable. Investments that promised steady returns were actually elaborate schemes designed to separate Eric from his money. The people he trusted most in the world systematically dismantled his financial future while he focused on his career. By the time Eric discovered the truth, it was too late. The money was gone, evaporated into failed properties and fraudulent deals. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. These weren't strangers or con artists from outside his circle. These were people who had sat at his family's dinner table, people he'd known his entire life. Eric's story illustrates perhaps the cruelest reality of sudden wealth. Sometimes the people closest to you pose the greatest danger. Trust, which should be the foundation of family relationships, became the weapon that destroyed his financial security. It was a lesson learned too late and at a cost too high to measure in dollars alone. Chapter 4. Derek Coleman, the dreamer who bet on Detroit. Derek Coleman was the first overall pick in the 1990 NBA draft, a dominant power forward who earned $87 million during his career. Unlike many players who went broke through obvious excess, Derek's downfall came from something almost noble. He wanted to save his hometown. Detroit was dying. The automotive industry that had built the city into an American powerhouse was collapsing. Neighborhoods that had once thrived were becoming ghost towns. Property values were in freefall, and the city seemed beyond redemption. While others fled, Derek saw opportunity, or maybe he saw obligation. He invested heavily in Detroit real estate, buying properties and funding revitalization projects with a passionate belief that he could help resurrect the city that had shaped him. It wasn't about flipping houses for quick profits or building luxury developments for the wealthy. It was about community, about giving back, about being the change he wanted to see. But good intentions don't stop economic collapse. The recession hit Detroit like a wrecking ball, accelerating the city's decline beyond anything Derek could have imagined. Properties he'd bought as investments became liabilities. Development projects stalled and then failed entirely. The city that he'd hoped to save instead consumed his fortune. Each property tax bill, each maintenance cost, each failed attempt to revitalize became another drain on his dwindling resources. Derek's story is unique among these cautionary tales because it wasn't driven by greed, ego, or reckless spending. It was driven by hope and a desire to make a difference. Yet the outcome was the same: millions lost, financial security evaporated, dreams demolished by the harsh mathematics of economic reality. His legacy serves as a reminder that even the best intentions require sound financial planning. Passion and purpose, while admirable, cannot overcome fundamentally flawed investments or economic forces beyond individual control. Chapter 5. Dennis Rodman, the party that never ended. Dennis Rodman was never conventional. The 5-time NBA champion, defensive genius, and rebounding machine earned millions during his career. But Dennis lived by his own rules, and those rules didn't include financial responsibility. The partying was legendary: trips to Las Vegas that lasted days, club appearances that cost fortunes, a lifestyle so excessive it became part of his brand. Child support for multiple children drained steady streams of cash. Luxury purchases accumulated like rebounds: cars, jewelry, clothes, experiences that provided momentary satisfaction but no lasting value. But the most devastating blow came from someone Dennis thought he could trust: his financial advisor. Peggy Fulford seemed credible, professional, trustworthy. She managed money for numerous professional athletes, presenting herself as a financial expert with the credentials and experience to protect their wealth. Dennis, like dozens of other players, placed his financial future in her hands. She was a complete fraud. Peggy Fulford wasn't a licensed financial advisor. She had no legitimate credentials. What she did have was a talent for deception and a complete lack of conscience. She systematically stole from the athletes who trusted her, creating false statements, diverting funds, and living lavishly off money that wasn't hers. By the time her scheme unraveled, She had stolen millions from dozens of professional athletes, with Dennis Rodman among her victims. The combination of excessive lifestyle spending, legal obligations, and outright theft left Dennis financially devastated. The man who had accumulated championship rings and millions in earnings found himself struggling to meet basic expenses, his wealth consumed by his choices and the criminals he'd trusted. Dennis's story became a warning about the dangers lurking even within the professional services industry. Not every person in a suit with a business card is legitimate. Not every advisor has your best interests at heart. And sometimes, the price of not asking enough questions is everything you've worked for. Chapter 6. Scottie Pippen, When Smart People Make Dumb Investments. Scottie Pippen didn't go completely broke, but his story deserves inclusion because it shows how even intelligent, careful people can lose fortunes through bad investments. The six-time NBA champion and Hall of Famer was Michael Jordan's partner in building a dynasty. He was thoughtful, strategic, and not known for reckless spending. Yet he still lost millions. The private jet seemed like a sound investment. Successful people own jets, and at $4 million, it was a purchase he could afford. There was just one problem: the jet didn't work. By the time Scottie discovered the extent of the mechanical issues, he'd spent millions on a luxury item that couldn't fulfill its basic function. The real estate investments seemed more conventional and safer. Scottie put substantial money into property developments and commercial real estate projects. These weren't speculative ventures in declining cities. They were supposedly sound investments in growing markets. Yet deal after deal went south. Developers disappeared. Projects stalled. Market conditions shifted. What looked like safe bets on paper became drains on his wealth. Scottie's experience demonstrates an important truth. Financial literacy isn't just about avoiding obvious scams or controlling spending. It's about understanding the investments you make, asking the right questions, and recognizing that even seemingly safe opportunities can go catastrophically wrong. You can be smart, careful, and strategic, and still lose millions if you don't truly understand where your money is going and who's managing it. Chapter 7. Allen Iverson, the answer who lost the question. Allen Iverson earned approximately $250 million during and after his career, through NBA salary, endorsements, and his iconic partnership with Reebok. He was the answer, the cultural icon who changed how basketball was played and perceived. He was also, by his own later admission, financially reckless in ways that almost defy comprehension. The spending was legendary. Allen maintained an entourage of 50 people, friends, family, hangers-on, whose expenses he covered without question. Private jets for routine trips. Shopping sprees that measured in hundreds of thousands. Jewelry that served no purpose beyond showing he could afford it. Parties that never ended because ending the party meant acknowledging reality. But beneath the obvious excess lay something more complex: distrust. Allen distrusted banks, distrusted the financial system, distrusted the conventional wisdom about saving and investing. He kept massive amounts of cash on hand, rejecting the advice of financial professionals who urged him to build sustainable wealth. In his mind, money in a bank wasn't really his. It was controlled by institutions he didn't trust and people who didn't understand where he came from. The lifestyle choices were extreme. Allen lived as though the paychecks would never stop, as though his earning power was infinite and age was just a number without meaning. He supported multiple households, made impulsive purchases, and treated his wealth as limitless. By the time retirement arrived, the $250 million was gone. The entourage scattered. The parties ended. The man who had been one of basketball's brightest stars found himself facing financial uncertainty. Allen's salvation came from an unusual source: a clause in his Reebok endorsement deal that he'd signed years earlier, probably without fully appreciating its value. The agreement included a trust fund that pays him $800,000 annually for life. It wasn't the fortune he'd earned, but it was enough to ensure he wouldn't end up destitute. His story became the most extreme example of how wealth can vanish, not through a single catastrophic decision, but through thousands of small ones, each seeming insignificant in isolation but devastating in combination. The pattern behind the pain. Marcus stared at the 7 faces on the screen, seeing patterns emerge from the individual tragedies. Each story was unique, but the themes repeated like a chorus. Overspending, living as though earning years would last forever, not recognizing that athletic careers are brutally short. Trusting the wrong people, whether family, friends, or so-called professionals, Placing blind faith without verification had destroyed fortunes. Poor financial planning. Failing to understand that money requires management, strategy, and long-term thinking. Failed investments, real estate deals, business ventures, and speculative projects that looked golden but turned to dust. Legal obligations, child support, lawsuits, and debts that compounded over time, draining wealth even after the paycheck stopped. The mathematics were brutal but simple. Even hundreds of millions of dollars divided by decades of post-retirement life, supporting multiple dependents, without ongoing income, equals financial devastation. The new generation and the path forward. The faces faded from the screen, and a new slide appeared: NBA financial literacy programs, building a better future. The league had finally acknowledged the crisis. Mandatory financial education sessions for rookies. Partnerships with certified financial advisors. Programs teaching young players about budgeting, investing, and long-term planning. Mentorship from retired players who had successfully managed their wealth. Resources for players to verify the credentials of anyone claiming to offer financial services. It was progress, but the question remained: would the next generation learn from the mistakes of those who came before, or would they repeat the same patterns, convinced that it could never happen to them? Marcus looked around the auditorium at his fellow rookies, young men who, like him, had just signed contracts worth millions. They were talented, confident, invincible. They were also, every single one of them, at risk of becoming another cautionary tale. The choice. The presentation ended, but Marcus remained seated, processing what he'd learned. 7 players. Hundreds of millions earned. All of it gone or severely diminished. The stories weren't ancient history. These men were still alive, still dealing with the consequences of choices made decades ago. He pulled out his phone and opened his banking app, staring at the balance that had seemed impossibly large just days ago. It was still more money than he'd ever imagined having, but now he understood something crucial. It wasn't infinite. Every dollar spent was a dollar that couldn't compound, couldn't grow, couldn't secure his future or support his family in the decades after basketball ended. Marcus thought about his own circle, the friends who'd suddenly become more attentive after his draft selection, the family members who'd mentioned business opportunities, the financial advisors who'd appeared out of nowhere with promises of wealth management and investment opportunities. He thought about Antoine Walker's inability to say no, about Eric Strickland's betrayal by family, about Derek Coleman's noble but financially disastrous dreams, about Dennis Rodman's fraud at the hands of a trusted advisor, about Scottie Pippen's failed investments despite careful planning, about Larry Johnson's crushing obligations, and about Allen Iverson's complete rejection of financial conventional wisdom. Each had lost fortunes in their own way, but each had faced a series of choices. And in every case, the choices had led to the same destination: financial ruin. Marcus made a decision. He wouldn't be the 8th face on that screen, the next cautionary tale in someone else's financial literacy presentation. He would ask questions, verify credentials, seek multiple opinions, and think long-term. He would say no when necessary, even to people he loved. He would understand every investment before committing a single dollar. He would treat his wealth not as permission to live recklessly, but as responsibility to build something lasting. The money he'd earned wasn't just payment for his basketball skills. It was opportunity, responsibility, and test, all wrapped into one bank balance. Whether it became generational wealth or another statistic of squandered fortune would depend entirely on the choices he made in the days, months, and years ahead. The lasting message. The stories of these 7 players aren't just about failure. They're about the opportunity we all have to learn from the mistakes of others. 60% of NBA players going broke within 5 years of retirement is a tragedy, but it's also a roadmap of what not to do. Every overspent dollar, every misplaced trust, every failed investment, and every ignored warning sign in these stories is a lesson available to anyone willing to learn it. The players who lost their fortunes paid the tuition for the financial education of everyone who comes after them. The question isn't whether athletes will continue to earn enormous sums. They will. The question is whether each new generation will recognize that wealth without wisdom is just a countdown to zero, that earning money and keeping money are entirely different skills, and that the decisions made in moments of abundance determine the reality of decades that follow. Marcus walked out of that auditorium carrying not just the memory of 7 fallen fortunes, but the determination to write a different story, one where talent and hard work lead not just to temporary wealth, but to lasting financial security and the wisdom to protect it. The choice, as it always is,